Hello, hello. So welcome to our presentation on an introduction to attachment basics, mindfulness and creative arts therapies. I have started just about a minute early to make sure that all of the technology is up and running and just to gather a few participants here. So once you hop on into the video, if you could please just type your name and wherever you're coming from, I can give you a little shout out here on the call, and I can also know that my technology is working. I'm really excited for our presentation today. We're going to talk about some amazing stuff, going to share some videos with you. We're going to do an experiential. I want to keep it lively and kind of interactive. So I'm hoping that you guys will really respond in the chat box and to the polls and different things that I have set up for you here today. So I'm just waiting to see a few names in the chat box. We've got about 7 attendees right now. So I really need to have, let's say, between 3 and 5 names and locations in that chat box before I get started. I need to know you're out there. I need to know who's listening and how we are going to maintain a really interactive conversation throughout this presentation. Attachment is such an essential subject, whether you are here for learning about yourself and self-help, or if you're here for continuing education and contact hours as a licensed creative arts therapist. I'm really happy to have you here. So if you could just give me your name and where you are coming from in the chat box, that lets me know that you can see and hear me okay. And I'm going to type that in just because I'm not seeing any names yet. Okay, great. So we have Nigel from Colorado. Welcome. We have Annie from Northern Norway. Welcome. We have Martha here for CEUs from Long Island. Welcome. We have Missy. Yay. We have Robert from Pennsylvania. Allison, we talked earlier. Great to have you. We have Robert, can see and hear me fine. That's awesome. Marta from Poland. Hi there. How are you? Great. I'm really excited to have you guys here. Okay, so I am going to pull up some slides for you. I am going to transition a little bit between different forms of media. If you notice that there's a bit of a delay or like there's a blank screen between the transitions, just give it a minute. It usually catches up. If for any reason you feel like you get disconnected, if you just refresh the page, it should start over again. It may start over with a delay, but if you just stick with it, you will catch up. All right, let's pull up our slides here. Go back to the beginning. And we are going to talk about first the origins of attachment and what brings us here. Okay, so here we are, an introduction to attachment basics, mindfulness and creative arts therapies. And you are going to need something to write with, either to take notes or to draw with. We are going to have an experiential during which time I'd like you somehow to respond to it for your own edification and reflection. So you want to make sure you have something to write with. Also, if you're here for continuing education, you also want to make sure you have something to write with so you can take note of our learning objectives. Okay, so first I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself. Why am I even here talking to you about this? Well, in addition to being a creative arts therapist, author, educator, and Reiki practitioner who has been in the field for over 10 years, I'm also a child of divorce. I moved around a lot as a kid. In fact, every 2 to 3 years after my parents split up when I was around 4 or 5 years old, my mom moved to a different state. And so I basically bounced back and forth between my parents for a long time. When my father remarried, I got 2 stepsisters, and so I became one of 4 siblings. I've also been married, and I've been divorced. I'm also a single mother, and that is my son, Aiden, you see there on the slide, and he has really taught me a lot about stepping into my own power and authority and really taking command of my attachment style for his sake. I was also a caretaker for my grandmother who had Alzheimer's before she passed away. And so that was difficult. But during that time, I learned a lot about my mom and where her attachment styles came from. And then later, I helped take care of my mother when she was diagnosed with cancer. And so this all came to a head around 2000, between 2015, 2016. And I started to experience a tremendous amount of grief in my life. I also had a romantic relationship at that time that did not go well. I was just so enamored and in love with this person and just wanted so hard to please and to keep him, but he couldn't prioritize me and he could not be faithful. And so when he walked away, my heart really just split open. And then I later found out that I had miscarried without realizing that I was pregnant. And I think it was really the combination of all these things happening, and also my body quite literally experiencing a tremendous amount of pain while it was releasing the potentiality of life, that it was like a trajectory of life that just didn't happen. And so I had this tremendous feeling of grief that was really complex and layered. And so that led me to exploring complicated grief. And once I fell down that rabbit hole, I really started learning much more about attachment. And so that led to being the general editor and co-author of my first published book called Complicated Grief, Attachment, Art Therapy, Theory, Treatment, and 14 Ready-to-Use Protocols. And in this book, 22 other creative arts therapists came together to talk about their experiences of grief and how they used creative arts therapies to really process their attachments and the complicated grief that can sometimes result from our attachment wounds. And so I just want to ask you here in the chat box, how many people on this call are a child of divorce? Or maybe you've moved around, or perhaps you are one of a blended family, right? You have many siblings. Maybe you've been married, or maybe you've been divorced or had your heart broken, or have you been a caretaker? So I was wondering, just in this, oh, Diane joined us. Hi, Diane. If in the chat box, if you could just type in, do any of these things apply to you? Because if they do, then you have experienced something related to attachment issues and wounds, right? That this has some complex impact on how we experience our love relationships. Okay, so in a nutshell, in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about attachment theory. I'm going to tell you what our learning objectives are as well. I'm going to share a video presentation on mindfulness-based practices, particularly how I personally processed some of my attachment wounds and the rage that was attached to them. We're going to do an interactive experiential, and we're going to have a live Q&A. Okay, so Missy mentions that she moved around every few years. Also, father left to go to war in her first year of life. Right. Nigel mentions all of the above except being a caretaker. Robert mentioned being married and divorced. Juliana mentioned blended family and moving around a lot and having a broken heart. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay. And I do invite you to stick around until the end of the presentation, because I'm going to be giving some discounted offers if you decide that you would like to further your learning. I'm also going to be telling you how you can get a free downloadable guided meditation that we use in the experiential, and how you can get your certificate of completion if you are here for continuing ed. Marta mentions that she experienced all of the above but has never been married. Okay, so for those of you that are here for continuing ed, and even if you're not, here are the learning objectives for our presentation. So first, by the end of this presentation, you will be able to identify the definition of attachment as it's understood in a psychodynamic context. You will be able to identify the definitions of secure, insecure, and disorganized attachment. You'll also be able to identify 2 out of 5 key intersections between attachment theory and creative arts therapies. And so let's just start by taking a look at the origins of attachment theory. Now, attachment theory is basically structured around this concept of proximity, which leads to appraisals, which ultimately results in felt security. Well, what does that mean? So originally, some of our old paradigms, the way we used to think about love and bonding in relationships, is that our attachments were really the result of feeding, okay? So children love their mothers because they're breastfed as babies. But that's not, we have discovered through certain kinds of research that that is really not the whole picture. That's not the whole story. Okay, so the first study I just want to call to your attention is Harlow, Harry Harlow's initial experiments. And in these experiments with infant monkeys, they were separated from their mothers around 6 to 12 hours after birth, and they were raised instead with substitute or surrogate mothers that were made of a heavy wire mesh. Now, both of these mothers were the same size, but the wire mother had no soft surfaces, while the other mother was cuddly, covered with foam, rubber, and soft terry cloth. Now, both mothers were also warmed by an electric light that was placed inside of them. Now, the important thing here is that even when the wire mother was the source of food and warmth, the infant monkey would spend a greater amount of time clinging to the cloth surrogate, the soft one, the one that was tactily inviting. And so these results led researchers to believe that the need for closeness and affection actually goes deeper than a need for food and for warmth. So this kind of messes up our, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And incidentally, Maslow worked with Harry Harlow. So basically, this suggested the importance of mother-child bonding. And not only does a child look to the mother for basic needs such as food and safety and warmth, but also needs to feel loved, accepted, and physical affection. Okay. Now, the second study that's worth mentioning here is that Konrad Lorenz found that baby ducklings or goslings imprint or become socially bonded to the first moving object they encounter, and that includes human beings. So he was really essential in establishing an understanding that our innate behaviors can play a role in the way that we adapt to our environments, particularly when it comes to attachment. So in other words, and I'm going to put this into a particular context, which I'll come back to later in this presentation, but let's say the temperament of a child can determine how the child's attachment system evolves and develops under certain conditions. And I'm going to come back to that later when we talk about parenting styles. Lorenz also believed that the evolutionary process underlies our development of behavior, and that in order to really conduct a legitimate procedure or to make legitimate claims about what we know about any individual, it has to be based on an experiential analysis of that individual. So on a case-by-case basis, that we can't make blanket statements about things. And that's really important to remember, especially when we're going to dive into attachment styles, right? We have to be aware of not boxing ourselves or other people into these categories. And we're going to talk about that more. Okay, so first we're going to talk about proximity. Well, remember I said that attachment theory evolved through this notion of proximity to appraisals to felt security. So first let's talk about proximity. Okay, so as a result of these studies, we really found that attachment is not the result of instinctual drives alone, such as feeding, but it's really more of a behavioral system that's aimed at developing social bonding through the achievement of optimal proximity. So, and we mean that quite literally. How close or how far away can you be from a primary caregiver, from your mother, from your parents, in order to feel safe, cared for, and as if you matter, right? And that's going to vary depending on the parenting style. And we're going to get into that. But essentially, through this frame, we start to understand that all infant behaviors appear to be geared towards achieving proximity with an attachment figure. So for example, if a child cries, smiles, crawls towards or away from them, starts walking, right? And they start to come towards mother or move away. Mahler calls this rapprochement, but let's say the child gets to the age where they're starting to crawl. They crawl away for a certain distance and they keep looking back to mom, to make sure mom's there, right? And if mom's there, maybe they're a little bit encouraged to keep going further. But then at some point they'll hit a wall and they'll be like, I'm too scared. And they run back to mom, okay? Mahler calls that rapprochement, but basically that child is figuring out what is the optimal proximity to my caregiver that allows me to feel safe and secure within myself and in my ability to explore, right? So now Bowlby, who's considered in some circles to be like the father of attachment, he basically observed that in general, reactions to separations follow a certain pattern, and that is protesting, becoming despairing, and then detaching altogether. So protest, at least in the observations that we made of children, involves crying, anger, searching for that caregiver, or seeking some form of escape. Despair is when there is diminished movement, right? We start to withdraw from contact. We're sad, we're moody, or we're hostile, and we lose interest in our favorite things. It's as if we're in a state of mourning. And then detachment In detachment, we might return to becoming sociable, and we might accept care from other people. But let's say that original attachment figure returns. Well, now we behave abnormally around them, right? We maybe we cry intermittently, or we're really clingy, or we just pretend that person isn't there altogether. And that tends to demonstrate a fear of abandonment now. So there were some criticisms of Bowlby's theory. They accused him of being a reductionist, that he's just a behavioral reductionism. And there were some critical questions that were raised, which is what happens when optimal proximity is secured? Why is it that sometimes when an attachment figure comes back, the child is still not secure? And therefore, why does it ease some children and it doesn't other children? So this is where we end up transitioning into appraisals, where the research turned from just focusing on proximity, which is more or less kind of a behavioral notion, to this concept of appraisals. And now when we start to think about appraisals, we start looking into the internal working models. We start looking at what are the cognitive and mental and emotional processes going on inside that child that affects attachment behavior. So the next researcher that really started to tackle these questions was Mary Ainsworth. And she suggested that the answers to these questions was in appraisals. So basically how much that child expects the mother to be available, accessible, and responsive to him, right? And so this would suggest that the child has a map or some kind of schema for his expectations that's organized based on past experiences. And so in the literature, this is referred to as an internal working model. Basically, I expect mom to respond in this way because in the past, she has in a particular circumstance in this particular context, right? So this can be impacted also by how well the child can appraise his or her own ability to elicit a response from that parent, right? So I expect this other person to respond because generally I have witnessed that my calls for attention are responded to, right? And so you begin to see how these early experiences can be extended to our adult relationships, right? We take that expectation and we extend it to our adult relationships. Additionally, appraisals was a really critical development in the research because it suggested that, and also took into account individual differences in experiences, right? How we filter our experiences. Now, Mary Ainsworth also developed what's called the strange situation procedure. And basically, she felt that it wasn't the mother's absence or the caretaker's absence, but the evaluation of her departure in the context of expected behavior that is important. So the strange situation is basically a scenario in which a child is exposed to a stranger, the mother leaves the room and the child interacts with the stranger, then the stranger leaves the room, the child is left alone, then the mother comes back, and then the stranger leaves. And it's a series of different exposures to mother or stranger. But the idea is what they really observe is how the child responds to the mother once the mother returns. And so if the child is really responsive and clingy and anxious, we assume the child has an anxious attachment style. If the child is detached, doesn't appear to notice whether or not mom comes in the room, they're considered to have a avoidant attachment style. If the child seems to oscillate between these two extremes, we consider that child to be disorganized. So, but there are some criticisms of this because the test itself really only looks at the quality of a child's relationship to one parent. Okay, so it could not be said to really measure a specific trait of that child's personality that could be extended to other relationships, right? So it started to take a look at how we might be able to extend this, into understanding how we evolve into our adult relationships, but it didn't quite make the mark. Like it only looked at one kind of relationship, right? It didn't account for the breadth of experience that we all have. And so now Mary Main steps on the scene, and Mary Main worked with Mary Ainsworth. She was helping her with the strange situation experiments from the start. And she ended up conducting a longitudinal study that examined a child in the strange situation as a toddler, then again at 6 years of age. And she also conducted what are called adult attachment interviews with the children's parents. Okay. And so what was really unique about this study was that her procedural methods were aimed at looking at the internal representational world of that child through the use of Polaroids, family drawings, personal narratives, discourse and imagination. So this is for all you creative arts therapists out there, right? Like we're starting to look at, okay, so this is how kids make appraisals and this is how they organize that information through the use of metaphor, symbol, imagery, right? And so with her interviews with the parents, she was also less concerned with what they were actually saying and more concerned with how they were saying it. So she was really focusing more on process than content. Because think about it. If you ask someone to take a survey and they answer yes or no, or they answer, a particular response, that may or may not be accurate, right? Because people have varying levels of insight into their own attachment styles, into their own behaviors, okay? So because she was, rather than looking at specifically what they were saying, right? Because an avoidant person, characteristically speaking, will say they don't have any issues, right? They're kind of disconnected from what they think their issues are. So their responses are going to look a certain way. And if we were just to go based on their responses, we would think everything's fine. So for example, I'm just going to give you an example from Maine's study. She asked one parent in this study about her relationship with her mother. And this parent said, oh, my mother was great. She was wonderful. And she said, well, tell me more about that. She said, oh, well, when I was young, I injured my arm and I went and I told my mother, but my mother said, I needed to be strong and to suck it up. And so this girl walked around for 4 days with an injured arm until a neighbor noticed, took her to the emergency room. Turns out she had a broken arm. But this parent's memory of that experience was, my mother taught me how to be strong, okay? Not that my mother neglected my broken arm for 4 days because she was dismissive. So you have to think about that, right? Her direct response would have indicated everything was fine. Yet the child that she was raising had an avoidant attachment style. So we had to figure out what was dismissive about this woman. And it turns out that her mother was dismissive and avoidant, right? But we wouldn't have known that based on her literal response. So this is what's really important about what Mary Main was doing. She was looking at process, right? She was looking at the affectual quality of the way people were responding to questions, not just what they said. Okay. So this really made attachment theory relevant to clinicians who focused on emotions and beliefs that they felt underlie behavior, right? Because prior to this, attachment was primarily kind of a behavioral sort of theory. And so because of Mary Main's work, we started to bridge what appeared to be a gap between behaviorism or clinical psychology and psychodynamic theory, okay? And her study also revealed specific parenting styles and attachment pairings, to which she added disorganized attachment. Prior to that, Ainsworth had only looked at anxious, avoidant, and secure. So let's look a little bit at that right now. Okay, so first I want to talk about secure attachment. So in Mary Main's studies, she found that children who had secure parents, meaning that they were able to be both in and outside of their experience. So they were capable of metacognition and of mentalizing. Okay, so they're reflective, responsive, thoughtful, and they're in control of their emotions, right? So parents who displayed these qualities had children who appeared to be flexible and balanced when seeking comfort in proximity to their caregivers. They were also comfortable exploring on their own. They were warmly welcoming to their caregivers when they would return after being absent. Additionally, their drawings appeared to be realistic and healthy, and they tended to enjoy looking at family Polaroids. Okay. Now, preoccupied parenting appeared to lead to anxious or ambivalent attachment in a child. And so basically, preoccupied parents were preoccupied with their own attachment relationships. So they're very discouraging of independent strivings in their child to the point of enmeshment. Okay. They're deeply anxious and fearful of abandonment themselves. They tend to be swamped by their own feelings and affect states. They also struggle with their own childhood recall. They struggle with the ability to be self-reflective and fully present in the moment. Okay. So in a strange situation, the child of a preoccupied parent would tend to focus only on the mother. They're very clinging and angrily resistant one minute, then maybe passively helpless the next. They're anxiously preoccupied with wherever their mother may be, and they tend to be inconsolable when the mom returns, and they really struggle with the ability to explore. Now, these children at 6 years of age, after their strange situation experiments, they would demonstrate intense feelings of need and anger. the solutions to separation scenarios were both rewarding and punishing. Their figures and their family drawings were very large and very small, very close together, and would feature vulnerable, intimate parts of the body. So there was a real sense of helplessness and vulnerability in their drawings. And their reactions to family Polaroids were deeply absorbed and disturbed. It would set off tics and anxieties about being abandoned. Okay. And so now when we look at dismissive parenting, Mary Main seemed to find that dismissive form of parenting would lead to avoidance in a child. So dismissive parents have a tendency to minimize the importance of love relationships. They struggle to recall their childhood experiences. They idealize problematic relationships, like the story I told you before about the little girl with the broken arm. They're emotionally constricted and they dismiss their feelings, and they tend to ignore bids for emotional and physical contact. Now, in a strange situation, the child of a dismissive parent tends to engage in exploration to the exclusion of attachment behaviors. Emotional expression is limited to investment in play objects, seemingly oblivious to their mother's return after she's been absent. And so they have a tendency to over-regulate themselves. Okay, they just cut themselves off from their emotions altogether. And so around age 6, after they had done these strange situation experiments, children, again, they appeared emotionally restricted and sullen. Their family drawings, the figures would be kind of dissociated and ungrounded, and they'd be far apart from each other, and they would just refuse to look at a family Polaroid. And lastly, we have unresolved or disorganized attachment. And this is the style that Mary Main added to the literature and theory after conducting this longitudinal study. So parents who are disorganized typically have experienced some form of trauma that was left unorganized in their childhood or in their life. Okay. So what's really important here is not that they experienced some form of trauma, but it's more the degree to which they were able to integrate that experience into a sense of meaning and understanding for themselves. Right? If it was split off or left unresolved and they just haven't really processed it or addressed it, the degree to which they have done that turned out or appears to be the degree to which the child becomes disorganized. Okay. So a child who has a parent like this tends to behave kind of bizarrely. They appear overly conflicted. They're kind of dissociated, or they behave unpredictably. They appear to be anxious one moment and then avoidant the next. And it seems to be the result of kind of paradoxical breakdown in their attachment system, because essentially the child has an inherent push to attach to someone that is supposed to be safe, but is actually threatening, and maybe even unpredictably one or the other, right? So there's no sense of continuity there. You might think of children of alcoholics, right? That there's maybe one moment there's affection and cuddling from the parent, and the next moment there's explosive rage, and you never know what it's going to be, right? So children who had parents that were unresolved in their trauma, they would appear to be inexplicably afraid around 6 years of age. Their family drawings included skeletons or dismembered body parts or figures that were scratched out or encapsulated. And when they were presented with a Polaroid, they'd become wordless, irrational, or distressed. Another thing that they noticed upon reunion with parents that had unresolved issues is that children might display what are called parentified behaviors. So they would either be caretaking of their parents, or they would be punitive and controlling. And presumably this would be to maintain proximity while at the same time dealing with the threat that these parents pose, right? So on one hand, they become parentified, that, they try to take care of the parents, and then they tell the parents what to do, because you realize, okay, I'm the one that has to step into this because they're not going to be able to do it, and we have to maintain this relationship in some way. And so the child sort of there's like a forced maturation that goes on there. Okay. So there are some exceptions to these rules. So again, remember I went back to Lorenz, who said, we have to be careful about putting people into boxes, right? The only way to conduct a true experiment is to conduct the experiment on one individual, one by one, because we have to really be careful about putting people into these boxes, because there are exceptions to the rule. And I have a tendency to believe that a lot of this is based on context. Okay. So some previously insecure attached individuals they did some studies and they found that they were able to achieve what's called earned secure attachment through marriage or another long-term relationship, such as with a therapist. And I don't have it on the slide here, but incidentally, they've done studies that show this is particularly true of anxious women who marry and become pregnant with secure men. And that's in the book Attached, that study. Additionally, securely attached individuals might lose that sense of, it's not only that scenario, but that happens to be one that shows that's a pretty high correlation. Additionally, securely attached individuals can lose their sense of security, let's say if they experience a trauma or a catastrophic event, such as, let's say, a parent dying or a natural disaster. And I would add to that, if a secure person ends up, let's say, dating someone who has a more severely insecure attachment style, depending on where they are in the kind of XY axis of avoidance and anxiety, I think secure people can lose their secure attachment as well. However, statistically speaking, the trend is more likely that an insecure person will become increasingly secure with a secure partner. And we're going to talk about that soon. Additionally, temperament can also play a role. Okay. So, I know so far we've talked about how, well, it seems like preoccupied parents tend to lead to anxious children and dismissive parents tend to lead to avoidant children and unresolved parents tend to lead to disorganized children. But I think that, let's say, for example, 8 out of 10 times, let's say a dismissive parent does create a dismissive avoidant child. But maybe 2 out of 10 times that child becomes anxiously clinging instead because they are searching for what they never got, right? Or equally, let's say a preoccupied parent, right, who's up your butt about everything you're going to do, everything you're going to say, never lets you do anything on your own because they're totally obsessed and anxious about everything that you're doing, right? So rather than adopt that kind of attachment style for yourself, maybe 2 out of 10 times you cut them off, right? You completely isolate yourself because you experience them as intrusive. And so in order to survive, you adopt more of an avoidant attachment style to avoid that intrusion, right? So while maybe 8 out of 10 times dismissive parents create avoidant, dismissive kids, but I think that there is those scenarios where it's kind of the opposite. And the reason I think that is because it's all on the same spectrum. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about how we are assessing attachment, which comes up next. All right. So again, all of this, the purpose of this is to achieve felt security, right? And that is really where attachment theory resides at this moment. We're looking at how secure do we feel within ourselves and within our relationships. And so how do we assess our own attachment style? Well, again, rather than thinking about it as like one of 4 boxes that you fall into, I'd like you to imagine it more like an XY axis. So on this screen here, you see that we have a spectrum of low anxiety and high anxiety. And then we have distance from partner and closeness to partner, right? So, and you can see here with, let's say you have low anxiety and you're comfortable being close to your partner, you're more or less to fall within the secure attachment quadrant, okay? If you need to be close to your partner, but you have high anxiety about it, you probably fall into preoccupied attachment, which is anxious attachment, okay? If you have distance from your partner or you push for distance from your partner and you have high anxiety about that distance, that's a little more disorganized. Okay, here it says disordered. You'll see that the language in the literature kind of jumps around, but this is more or less what they're talking about. Okay, and if you are distant from your partner and you don't have a lot of anxiety about it, you tend to be more avoidant. Okay. Now, can attachment styles change? This is a question I get all the time on my YouTube channel and in working with clients. And so I'm going to show you, this is an attachment assessment that I took online. And if you purchase the course materials today, there's a link to take this assessment yourself. This is my attachment style. I think I took this test in 2015. So you can see that I actually fell into the fearful avoidant category. That's disorganized. Again, see there's all this language that the literature uses. But fearful avoidant is the same as disordered or disorganized. Okay. Sometimes they call it anxious avoidant, which basically means that your behaviors swing back and forth on that pendulum. You have like fast cycling. Okay. So I told you when I started getting into all this stuff, I was really going through a period of grief, and I was exploring my complicated grief and my attachment styles. And based on my responses, I fell into a fearful avoidant category. Well, can that change? Over the course of 2 years, it has changed. So I'm now less avoidant, but I have higher anxiety. But you know what? That kind of makes sense, right? Because if I'm becoming less avoidant, that means that I am working towards confronting and feeling the feelings and emotions that I may have split off in order to confront them, right? So if I'm allowing myself to feel those things and have those experiences, it means that I now have to feel them, right? I have to feel them in order to allow them to move through me and release them. And we're going to talk more about that when we get into our experiential portion. I'm actually going to show you a big thing that I did to try to affect that process. Okay, so right now what I'd like to do is put up a poll for you, and I'd like to know what kind of attachment style do you feel you have and or resonates with you. And this is a completely anonymous poll. You can just click whatever button you think applies to you, and we can get a sense of, you know, how everyone is experiencing this. All right. And so while you guys are responding to that, we're going to talk a little bit about attachment in adulthood, particularly in adult relationships. Okay, so it looks like right now we're kind of half and half with anxious attachment and avoidant attachment. Okay, a little bit more anxious, 57% anxious, 43% avoidant. Okay. All right, so then you're probably going to be really interested in this next piece of the presentation. So I'm disorganized. Okay. So let's just take a look at what is a secure relationship? Because, you know, sometimes we talk about secure relationships and it's really kind of an abstract notion, particularly, you know, if we feel as if we might be anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, right? It's like this kind of magical thing that kind of exists just beyond the horizon, and who knows what the heck that means anyway. So essentially a secure relationship, it means that there is a comfortability with closeness. Okay, so secure partners tend to be unconcerned about their boundaries. So they seek intimacy and they're really not afraid of being enmeshed. Okay, because they aren't overwhelmed by a fear of being slighted or abandoned, which is kind of an anxious quality. And they don't become overwhelmed with the need to run away or deactivate as intimacy grows for a fear of being intruded upon, which is more of an avoidant characteristic. And so they find it easy to enjoy closeness, whether it is physical or emotional. They're also quick to forgive in their relationships because they assume that their partner's intentions are good, and therefore they're likely to forgive them when they do something wrong or hurtful. Now, people who have insecure attachment tend to be black and white thinkers. They split things into black and white. And so when you have a fight, your partner suddenly becomes like this terrible villain that has nothing but malintentions and only wants to hurt you, right? They become a sadist that you just don't understand. But we're not able to kind of step out of that. And that has to do with sacral stuff. We're going to talk about sacral stuff in a minute. They're also inclined to view sex and emotional intimacy as one thing. So they don't need to create distance by splitting them up. Okay, so by being close emotionally or sexually, but not both. Okay, they treat their partners with love and respect. I'm not going to talk too much about that. That's pretty self-explanatory. They're also secure in their power to improve the relationship. So they're confident in their positive beliefs about themselves and others, which would make that a logical assumption. Of course, I have power to change this relationship. Why wouldn't I? And they also feel responsible for their partner's well-being. So they expect other people to be responsive and loving towards them. So they are loving and responsive towards other people. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what I will refer to as mixed relationships. And basically this addresses the question, well, but what if a secure person is paired with an insecure person? Well, the research shows that insecure individuals can achieve, as we mentioned before, earn security through committed relationships with secure partners or therapists. Additionally, there's no difference between the rates of relationship satisfaction between couples in which both partners are secure or mixed couples where one partner is secure and the other is insecure. Ooh, that's really hopeful, at least from my perspective. And so it's suggested that this is because of how secure people tend to respond to their partners in conflictual relationships, right? So in a fight. So for example, secure partners, their feelings of security benefit those heated moments because they are de-escalators, okay? So during a fight, they don't need to act defensively or to injure or punish the other person. And so it tends to prevent the situation from escalating, right? They don't demonize their partners. They're also mentally flexible, so they're not threatened by criticism. And if necessary, they will revise their beliefs and their strategies if they think you have a point. They're also effective communicators. They expect others to be understanding and responsive, and so they express their feelings freely and accurately to their partners because it comes naturally, and they do it when they feel it. And they're also game busters. They want closeness, and they believe that other people do too. So why would you play games to try to have some kind of power play in the relationship, right? Okay, so now we're just going to talk a little bit about the anxious avoidant trap. Now, I refer to the anxious avoidant trap as a love that mirrors our earliest wounds. And so the spirit, the soul, the neuronal pathways in your brain, your quantum energy, our unconscious self, whatever you want to call it, it believes that it sees in this partner an opportunity to relive in order to revise old love patterns. Okay. Now, Harville Hendricks would say this is their imago match, right? And so these patterns are usually very deep and sometimes beyond our conscious awareness. And so the avoidant typically projects his or her repressed neediness onto an anxious person, and that anxious person then takes it in as what we call a projected introject on top of their own issues. So it's as if the avoidant partner is saying to the anxious person, "You make me feel alive, and I love that about you. But it also terrifies me because I don't really know who I am on a soul deep level, and I don't know what it means to be alive because I never learned how to identify and discern my own emotions or to know what it means to be intimate. And so if I let you in, you'll become everything, and that will smother and kill me. I will cease to exist, and I am not strong enough to contain you like that." Right? I had a great comment on one of my YouTube channels that talks about the anxious and the avoidant just having different radio dials, like for their emotions. Like one might be a small boombox and the other's like a huge house sound system, right? And so the anxious person is kind of like the sound system, and they turn the dial way up and it's going to drown out the boombox, right? That there has to be a way for them to communicate with each other. So then the anxious person tends to reply to this, unspoken communication, "Oh, but I can save you. I can show you how. If only you'd let me love you unconditionally, back to life. If only you'd let me in, you'd see how wonderful being fused in mind and body and spirit can be. Why would you ever want anything but that feeling? Why would you ever want to put space between us? If you leave me, I will cease to exist. I'm not strong enough to exist on my own," right? You just want to pour yourself into the containment, right? So basically it's two ends of an extreme, but it is the same spectrum. Okay, so the avoidant, while feeling trapped by the anxious partner, also kind of admires him or her and wants to feel the warmth and the affection and the joy of that person's life force, right? Of their fire and their energy. Now, the anxious partner, usually while feeling unfulfilled in the relationship, admires the avoidant's independence, their charisma, and their ability to be self-sustaining. And so there are, like the anxious partner wishes they could walk away the way the avoidant can. Right? They just don't feel like they can do it. And so they tend to be mirrors for each other, kind of like that yin yang symbol. And so there's just a little drop of the other within each other, right? Okay. So I want to talk about, so the anxious ambivalent partner, there's a few characteristics. They tend to be more inclined to play games. They tend to expect you to guess what's wrong, kind of read their minds. They act out when you don't behave the way that they think you should. They have egocentric thinking. So it's always like, what did I do wrong? Why don't you like me? They are always somehow the root of the problem, and that's how they perceive it. Like they're kind of the center of everything. They expect you to set the tone of the relationship. So why hasn't he called me in 3 days? Where's this relationship going? I don't know. He hasn't said anything. All right, I'm just going to wait until he says something. That whole internal monologue, you're expecting someone else to set the tone of the relationship rather than saying, "Oh, I like that person. I'm going to call them." Or, "Oh, I really want XYZ to evolve out of this relationship. I better start that conversation with them so I know where we're at," right? You're also preoccupied with the relationship. You're obsessed with it. You're checking your phone every 10 minutes. You're afraid some small act or thing that you do could ruin or end the relationship, and tend to be suspicious and or fearful of infidelity. Now, the avoidant partner intentionally or unintentionally creates distance. They tend to emphasize their boundaries. They're also unrealistically romantic. I would say this kind of applies to the anxious person too. But the way an avoidant person does it is they'll say things like, oh, they'll be in a relationship with someone and they'll be like, yeah, this is great. I'm getting something out of it, but they'll never be the one that got away, right? Or, they're just kind of waiting for someone to sort of swoop in and, pour all of themselves into them and save them in the way that, an omnipotent mother would, and show them the value of love to make them love, like to make them feel that kind of vitality that they don't just feel on their own. Oh, well, maybe, I don't do this, or I don't commit, or I only ever enter into open relationships unless I meet the one, right? Or maybe I just haven't met the right person yet. It's kind of like you have to be in that state of congruence before someone else can come in and be an equal partner to you. You're still waiting for someone else to change something about your internal mindset, your internal working models, right? They also tend to be mistrustful and suspicious. They have rigid rules about things. I dated a guy once who said that that he would only allow himself to see the people he was dating 2 days a week. And like there were rules about which days they could be. It's like, what? They withdraw or explode in a conflict. They avoid defining the relationship. They like to keep things foggy. Why do we need to label things, right? And they also avoid talking about the relationship at all. Okay. And so I'm going to put up another poll here for you guys. I want to find out how many of you feel like you may have fallen into the trap. And again, this is a completely anonymous poll. You can just answer in there whatever comes up for you. We have a yes so far. Okay. So I want to get into the 5 intersections between creative arts therapies and attachment. Okay. Now, there's 5 dimensions. There's probably more than 5, but I'm just going to talk about 5 on this webinar. So first, we have sensory-based interventions. Okay, so sensory-based experiences in early childhood tend to enhance our secure attachment, our affiliation with others, empathy, and self-regulation, because the body is the first organizer of experience, right? We first learn things by putting them in our mouths. We first notice that we are separate from everything else in the universe because we poop and pee, right? And because we eat. Like these are the areas that are stimulated in our bodies from infancy. And so it's all tactile, like the monkey experiments. They connected with the fake monkey that was tactily stimulating. Okay, so there's something huge about sensory-based interventions for people who struggle with attachment stuff. And creative arts therapies provide these experiences through visceral, visual, kinesthetic, tactile, olfactory, and auditory stimulation. Okay. Then we also have nonverbal communications. So self-expression through an arts-based activity becomes a major source of communication, particularly for children who don't always have the words to accurately convey their feelings and their experiences. So art making, and by art making, I mean, drama, music, dance, movement, things like that, can provide a bridge between child and caretaker, or let's say even in an adult relationship between partners, that can improve the reciprocity and their attunement. Also, nonverbal expression through something like painting or some kind of play or imaginative role play or movement can also be corrective in and of itself. So basically what that means is just by doing this, you are energetically and affectively feeling something good, and it's reshaping some pathway in your brain without necessarily having to verbally, talk about it, interpret it, or integrate it. Okay. So on our poll here, we have 73% respondents feel like they have fallen into the trap. 9% feel like they have not, and 18% think maybe they have. Okay. So thirdly, right hemisphere dominance. So now the right hemisphere of the brain stores what we talked about earlier, our internal working model for attachment relationships and our affect regulation. So basic understanding of affect is like your body language, your facial expressions, and the way you're kind of emoting, right? Like like when someone walks into the room, like let's say they have a poker face, but you can tell they're mad. Like how can you tell they're mad? That's all the affective communication that you're receiving. Okay. So the output of the right brain is expressed in, let's say, non-word based ways. So drawing a picture, for example, or using an image to describe your feelings or events. And so research tends to suggest that sensory-based interventions are effective for trauma treatment because they not only because they don't rely on the individual's use of their left brain, which is language processing, and are primarily right brain driven anyway. Okay, so we don't have to re-traumatize someone by forcing them to embed it in their left brain processing. Okay, and again, I mentioned a little bit about what affect means, but basically affect regulation, again, refers to our ability to self-regulate, okay, to monitor our own emotional feelings, our physical responses to stress, okay? And so creative arts therapies create positive sensory experiences, and that becomes a resource for organizing our overwhelming emotions. So, you know, an easy way to say this is that when you're young and you're learning about things like you're crawling around, you're putting things in your mouth, you're exploring and whatnot, all of that comes together to help you form pictures, words, symbols in your brain that help you organize how you feel about something. Now, if you had a parent who didn't allow you to explore, who didn't allow you to attach your own meaning to things, what happens is you kind of split off from that part of yourself and you stop knowing how to organize it, right? So you lose touch with your feelings, or they overwhelm you, okay? And then you're fearful of your own feelings, and so you cut yourself off from them altogether. So when we're able to use things like dance, drama, movement, meditation, okay, music, what happens is that stimulates that exploratory part of you again. And now we're starting that process over again. And now we're learning how to do that, how to assign some level of organization to our feelings so that we don't have to feel overwhelmed by them or fearful of them so that we have to cut them off. Okay, and relational interactions. So generally speaking, social relationships tend to shape how our brains develop, right? And of course, attachment is a part of that. And so when change arises from positive experience, they tend to contribute to resiliency, right? So interpersonal neurobiologist Dan Siegel says that when change arises from positive experiences, such as, let's say, when we engage with novel or enriching experiences through imaginative play and other creative experiences, that is what allows us to feel resilient if we're put into a difficult situation again. So novelty is really important, as is enrichment and creativity. Okay, so those are 5 dimensions. If you didn't get them all written down right now, I will go over the learning objectives before we end this presentation. This presentation is about an hour and a half, so I'm just being mindful of the time. I want to move on to our mindful approach to treatment. And this is where I'm going to talk more about chakras and energy and how that ties into bottom-up versus top-down processing. Okay. So the root chakra is our first chakra, and it's located in the genital pelvic region of the body. And it is associated with a basic sense of safety, security, and body integrity. And its shadow aspect is fear. Okay. And so this is often a part of the energetic system in your body that is disrupted when you have attachment issues. Equally, the sacral chakra, which is just above it, between the navel and the genital region, this is the chakra that is most associated with our emotions, right? Our ability to have and feel our emotions. It also impacts our ability for affect regulation, to know our feelings, to name them, to make sense of them, to organize them. Also to feel pleasure and to be able to play. And of course, that's connected to creativity, right? Because that's what allows us to hold dualities, right? I hate mom, but she's a good person and I love her anyway. Development in the sacral chakra, and that is around ages 0 to 2, that's what allows us to have that kind of broad perspective. If we have some arrestments from the ages of 0 to 2, like for some reason, like let's say your parent just couldn't handle the terrible 2s very well, what happens is that gets kind of stuck there. It gets kind of frozen. And so rather than being able to hold what appear to be ambiguous feelings, we split them and we say they're 2 totally separate things. So they're either good or bad, black or white. That person did a bad thing, that person's evil, right? As opposed to, oh, well, that person behaved badly, but overall they're generally a good person, right? We don't do that. We don't do that. And so if either of these chakras are interrupted, it's pretty likely that there are some attachment issues afoot. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. So for example, let's say if those early years were traumatic or particularly difficult for whatever reason, what happens is that individual ends up on one end or the other of a polarized presentation. So they could present with all kinds of dichotomies. They could be very loose and expansive with their boundaries or very rigid with impenetrable boundaries. They could also struggle with food issues, being over or underweight. And that's because their relationship to food, which remember is a metaphor for nurturance, love, and bonding, was never quite organized enough. So they're either hyper-controlling of it, or they can be reliant on it for emotional support. And remember, food has that direct relationship to our experience of our body and our feelings about our bodies when we're infants, right? So while the root chakra is developing, we learn about stuff by sticking it in our mouths, right? And through interactions with our parents through feeding, okay? So how we feel about our body tends to be exemplary of our attitudes towards our own sense of selfhood. And that's on a very visceral and pre-verbal level, okay? Now, in terms of, so these individuals who might struggle with these things could also take up a lot of space. They carry, for example, they might carry a ton of bags wherever they go, and they splay out wherever they land, sort of in a demand or a request, subconscious, unconscious request to be seen and contained. Or they could become contracted and hypervigilant about how much space they take up, opting for minimalism, always sitting with their legs crossed and jigging, arms folded across their chest, perhaps hunching down into themselves with kind of a wispy or mumbly voice. Or perhaps they have a voice that is a bit shrill or strikingly loud, as if they're trying to be heard above everyone else, despite how small and unburdensome they might be trying to make themselves and their bodies. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I have 8 tips for working with attachment issues, and or if you're here to learn more about, self-help things, these are some things to be aware of in yourself. Okay, so the first is to avoid interpretation, whether you're analyzing yourself, because it has been my observation that people, particularly who have upper chakra dominance, meaning like they've have some attachment stuff, and so their energy has escaped that part of the body, and it's all in their head, and they become creative intellectualizers and people who like to fantasize and withdraw into their dreams and escapes or whatnot, and overanalyzing things. We have a tendency towards interpreting stuff maybe a little too fast, because that helps us. Well, if we've already figured it out, then we don't have to feel it, do we? Okay, so when I talk about avoiding interpretation, basically I'm saying that when you jump instantly to interpreting something, it's going to pull you out of your body, and it's going to encourage that upper chakra dominance. So, and that tends to manifest in symptoms of dissociation or being over-intellectualizing, right? And it tends to make you a little bit obsessive in your thinking, and I have noticed tend towards automatic negative thoughts, okay? You're trying to pull yourself out of actually having the feeling, and that is kind of contraindicated to healing from attachment wounds. Secondly, you want to focus on the nonverbal, because as we've just gone over in detail, attachment experiences are primarily sensorial and connected with our earliest phases of development. You also want to be aware of anger, the presence of rage and its manifestations. So attachment wounds often include a conflictual relationship to your anger and how to manage your rage. So it can be split off and buried, and tend to leak out in unhealthy ways, like through anxiety or depression, particularly if you've turned it in on yourself, or it could become explosive and difficult to contain altogether, okay? You also want to be aware of the fear of abandonment, and I'm not going to go too deeply into that because I think that one's pretty obvious. You want to be aware of addictions, okay? And when I say addictions, I'm talking about anything that you do compulsively, okay, that somehow facilitates some numbing effect or some form of escape, okay? So, and that again goes back to the root chakra and food and affection and other things as being a basic survival need. So as infants, again, we use the mouth to explore and feel pleasure, sucking, biting, putting our thumbs, fingers in our mouths, toys in our mouths, right? Mother's breast in our mouths. And so when this is allowed to happen naturally, it encourages growth and balance in our root and sacral. If for whatever reason this process is disrupted, feelings of fear and guilt predominate, right? So the shadow aspect of the root is fear, and the shadow aspect of the sacral is guilt, Okay. And so then that tends to manifest through anxiety and addictive behaviors. And as I said, both ingestive, such as with food, drugs, or alcohol, and non-ingestive, such as with, let's say, love addiction or sex addiction, workaholism, shopping addiction, things that we are doing to fill ourselves up, right? Okay. You also want to be aware of body language and attitudes. So how does the client, or how do you take up space? And when you're aware of that, then you'll see that it is a metaphor for the internal working model. Because remember, this goes back to proximity. The negotiation of space is really indicative of how we navigated that early task of our proximity to our parents. So when someone walks into your office, if you're a therapist, if someone walks into your office and they knock over a stack of books and then like pay no attention to it, or maybe they come in and as I suppose they splay their bags out all over the place without realizing it, or maybe they come in and they're really like, they need you to tell them where to sit and where to go. And they remain folded up and into themselves, like hyper mindful that they bumped, let's say they bumped the magazines on your table and then they quickly go to straighten it. Okay. So all of that kind of seemingly innocuous behavior is actually a metaphor for how we've negotiated that early proximity that we achieved with our attachment figures. Okay. 7, you want to be flexible but firm with your boundaries, okay? Because someone who struggles with attachment issues, their boundaries will typically be too loose or they'll be too rigid or strict. So you have to try to model a healthy in-between without getting snowed over. So if you're too loose, let's say with someone who is kind of either too loose or too rigid, they could want to merge with you and or not view you as a strong or empowered figure, okay? And if you're too rigid with your boundaries, they could push harder and harder against you, right? Against the lines that you draw, trying to suck you into kind of a manipulative power play where they're trying to outwit you or something like that. Or on the other hand, they feel like you're too cold and uninviting and they can't connect with you, okay? And lastly, you want to emphasize self-compassion over self-esteem. All right. And what do I mean by that? Well, self-esteem emphasizes action, forward movement, and productivity. So basically, it's like saying, look, I'm a good person because I can do X, Y, Z. And that's really problematic for individuals with root and sacral issues or attachment issues because they've already plagued by feelings as if they're undeserving, right? So quite literally that they don't have a right to exist and they have to earn it. And so that right of the root chakra is to be and to exist. And the right of the sacral is to have and experience your feelings. So often individuals who struggle with attachment stuff, they can become high achievers and they turn approval into esteem, right? Approval for their external products into esteem. Problem with that is it tends to feed a false persona. And ultimately it leads to a sense of internal vacancy. So because their root and the sacral are not developed enough, they also don't benefit from the rights of those chakras, which is, as I said, to be and to have and experience your feelings. So they might gain some gratification from the approval of their products, right? Of making a ton of money, of getting a lot of prestige, of achieving a lot in their career or in their lives, but they're never quite able to take in because they don't essentially feel they have a right to own their own products or the approval that they've achieved itself, right? They don't have a right to the things that they've gathered. And so the emphasis should really be on self-compassion, right? Validating the root's right to exist and the sacral's right to feel, regardless of what you do, okay? That regardless of whatever you do, you have a right to be here. You have a right to feel your feelings. You don't have to earn that right, okay? And so once that's in place, then we can start working on esteem. And that pertains more to the solar plexus, which is up in the abdomen. And that's the basic right to act and to have authority over what you do. Okay, I'm not going to get into that in this presentation, but that's essentially what it is. Okay, so now mindfulness-based interventions, to my mind, can fall into 2 categories. And usually these are fast cycling. So for example, top-down versus bottom-up. Well, top-down refers to the direction in which the energy needs to go in order to affect healing for that person. So if someone with attachment issues, they experience some early trauma, and what happens is they react by shooting all their energy up to their head. They call that upper chakra dominance. All the energy goes up to the head. So they escape into fantasy, intellectualization, analyzing, overthinking things or whatever. And so they're all up here and there's nothing down here, right? So one of the ways that we can address that in a therapeutic situation is we start with a concept, right? Because people People like this will really like concepts. They'll like the education around it. They'll like the understanding of it first before they dive in. So you might start with like an art making directive, draw a family map, for example, or, draw an image of your last relationship, like draw an image of a problem from your last relationship. Okay, now let's take that image and put it into our bodies and just witness what happens to it. Okay, now let's process it verbally. So we took a concept, we made it visual, third eye stuff. We made it visual. So it was kind of working with upper chakra stuff here. But they're also being stimulated by the body because they had to make the marks themselves. They had to move their hand across the page, right? And then we went a little bit further and we said, okay, we're going to do a meditation and ask them to literally take that image into their bodies and explore that inner space. So that's a process from top down. Now there's bottom up. Now some people with attachment issues, they don't go up into that headspace, right? They're a bit more subscribed by their bodily sensations, okay? They're just like, but when I'm with them, the chemistry is amazing. And but yeah, I've been unhappy in the relationship. Oh, but that magical moment when the sex just blows my mind away. I just feel so safe, right? So that's like a bodily experience, okay? And so in that instance, we have to draw whatever they're experiencing in the body up into the upper realms so that they can start to create consciousness and spaciousness around it and identify their triggers before they become swamped by that kind of addictive reaction they have on a physical level to their attachment wounds. So in this case, we might start with meditation. If you're feeling anxiety right now, or you're feeling depression, tell me where in your body that starts from. Where is its point of origin? Okay, let's watch that. Let's witness it. Okay, now that you've witnessed it, let's take it out of the body and put it on the paper and make art about it and then process it, right? But this can be a cycle that we move through. You can move through this like a cycle over and over again. You can do it several times in a session. And I know that I certainly have. Okay, so I'm going to share with you a video of my own process. I said I was going to share with you how I went through this process myself. And particularly, this is going to be a video of how I processed my anger surrounding my grief and my attachment relationships. And once that's over, it should be about we'll see how much time we have. And then we will end with an experiential. Okay, so I guess I will share with you a little bit about my process. I have a really polarized relationship with anger, and I think it has a lot to do with how I grew up. I think that my models for anger are either to be really detached and disconnected from those feelings, or overwhelmed by them, but I could probably count on my hand how many times I've really yelled. So my anger ends up getting turned in on myself, and I think my anger is a lot of what eats away at my sense of self-worth. I think that if I am angry or express that anger, that I will scare someone away, or that I will be abandoned, or that I will lose out on all the things that I want, like love and affection. But in my process today, I started out with a meditation. Once I started doing this, which is a way to open your heart chakra and stimulate that, and chant, that it opens up a portal. And I was actually really surprised at how fast I descended into that feeling. It was like it was just waiting to be acknowledged or touched upon. And why did I choose to smash dishes? Well, I don't know why. I've always had this fantasy of getting really angry and smashing a dish. And in the past, when I have been really angry, I've gone to try to do that and just have not been able to do it. So, and even in my dreams, I'll have dreams where I want to smash a dish and I'm not able to do it. And just over the past year, when I've been doing a lot of self-reflection and investigation and taking ownership of the things that I need to take ownership of, I finally had a dream in the past few weeks that I was rejected and abandoned by a more recent partner. And in the dream, again, he rejected me, and I went into a kitchen and I smashed every single dish in that kitchen. And of course, when I woke up, I was sobbing. It's really sad. And angry, but that was the first time in my life I'd been able to do that. In my dreams, I was able to do it. And so I thought, well, if I'm sweating it out in my dreams, then I have to find a way to make that reality. So today is about releasing that. Today is about finally smashing those dishes. Today was about releasing that anger in a way that felt safe and contained for me. And the movements were, with the hands, with the shaking the hands in the beginning and pulling them together. This was yoga inspired, and also drawing the energy into the hands, because I felt like I would need to draw the energy into my hands in order to really smash those dishes. And as I was smashing them, it felt really good. And there was a point where I got to the end of the dishes that I was okay smashing, and realized it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. I needed to go back for more. And I didn't give a fuck if I had no dishes by the end of it. And so now I have a couple of plates, no bowls, and no dessert dishes. So we'll have to replace those. But going through the process, it's like I kind of came to the end of what I felt like I could smash, and it still wasn't enough. And so then the drums that I had playing, they were shamanic drums. I let them come into my body, and I started feeling like I wanted to move. And so the up and down kind of movement of energy, and the turning from side to side and creating this circular motion is sort of drawn from Tai Chi practices. And I wasn't really thinking that at the moment, it just felt kind of natural. And then in the end, I felt like I had to bring myself to some kind of, I don't want to say close, because I probably kicked up a lot of stuff that needs to keep moving, but I needed to somehow contain that experience for now. And so I went back to the chanting, and then I transitioned into art making. And so with the art making, I took pieces from the dishes that I smashed and put them onto a black paper and surface and sprayed paint over them. And I found myself thinking, as I was removing the pieces, how much space were those pieces taking up, and how much vacancy is there now? And I don't mean vacancy in a bad way. I mean vacancy in terms of like now I have room to breathe. And as I was going through making the art piece, I thought to myself, well, what am I going to fill up those fragmented parts with? And I felt like I needed to fill them up with love, and I needed to fill them up with love for myself. And just allow the universe to move through me. And so, as I do with my other practices, I just sort of allowed my hand to move and pick whatever colors felt natural. In my body, I really felt a lot. I actually started cramping a lot. I felt dizzy. It felt as if like a hose had been turned on, and it was just sort of whooshing like a whirlpool between my hips up to my head. So there was like whoosh, whoosh. That's what it feels like. Still kind of feels like that, and actually I still am cramping and it's not my time to be cramping. So I think there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of stuff stored that I'm letting go. There's a lot of releasing that's going on, and that even what's going on in my body is this kind of contracting, expanding and contracting process. And so how do I feel now? I feel accomplished. I feel like that had been on my mind for a long time, and I've been coming up with excuses not to do it. You know, I'll make a mess, or I'll wait and I'll do it in the basement, or I'll have to find a vacant parking lot to smash dishes. And ultimately I realized the safest place to do that would be in my own home, in my kitchen, in the way that it panned out in my dream. And if I have to sweep for the next 3 hours afterwards, that's what I'm gonna have to do. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's like a nice way to close this at the moment. I think that this is part of the process, is just releasing and letting things move, and knowing that it's not getting to some next destination, that it's really just about letting things move, being a vessel, allowing the release. So thank you for coming with me on this journey. Okay. So I hope you enjoyed that demonstration, and that's an example of how bottom up and top down. I was actually kind of cycling through both of them probably a few times throughout that demonstration. So the next thing that I wanted to do, I wanted to share an experiential with you that we could do together, but I'm just aware of the time. It's 3:16 and this webinar is an hour and a half, and I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. So what I have done is I have a guided meditation for you, and it is available to anyone that participated in this webinar as a download. Additionally, I want to also let those individuals who are taking this presentation for continuing education, I want to let them know how they can get their continuing education credits, just summarize our learning objectives, and then tell everyone else how, if you want to deepen your learning, that I have a course called Healing Through Attachment Wounds that you might benefit from. And I have a fast action bonus if you decide to purchase that today. So I'm going to show you how to get the free guided meditation and download if you want to go through a process, not necessarily like the one I just shared with you, but if you want to try listening to a meditation, it's and observing what comes up for you in a process like that. It's called the Sacred Body. And basically it's about calling split off parts back to yourself so that you can feel more sovereign and whole in your heart space. So let me pull up my slides again here. Okay. So for those of you that are getting or going to be taking this course for continuing education, I'm going to put up an offer here. It's called an offer, but basically it's a link, and it will say there, purchase course materials. So this will be the link. If you click on that, it will take you to a sales page where you can purchase the course materials. You'll have to take a course evaluation and a learning assessment. And once you take the assessment, a certificate will automatically be triggered and emailed to your email. So once again, before you do that, let's just go over our learning objectives. And the first one was to identify the definition of attachment as it is understood in a psychodynamic context, to identify the definitions of secure, insecure, and disorganized attachment, and identify 2 out of 5 key intersections between attachment theory and creative arts therapies. So let's go over those. So first, attachment is a behavioral system aimed at developing social bonding through the achievement of optimal proximity, appraisals, and felt security. Okay, so you want to remember optimal proximity, appraisals, and felt security. And additionally, if you do purchase the course materials to take the assessment, there is a course review and evaluation. So you get an outline of this whole presentation if you do that. Also, attachment style, secure attachment. People who have secure attachment, they trust his or her needs will be met. They're reflective, trustworthy, and consistent. They enjoy intimacy, and they have good boundaries. People who are insecure tend to not trust that their needs will be met. They're either anxiously clinging or detached and distant. They fear abandonment and or tend to be isolative. And they have loose or rigid boundaries. And people who struggle with disorganized attachment, they tend to be confused about their needs and they don't know how to get them met. They exhibit bizarre, dissociated, or contradictory behaviors, and they can be angry and intrusive one minute or passive and non-responsive the next. And once again, here are our 5 intersections with creative arts therapies. So first would be sensory-based interventions, nonverbal communications, right hemisphere dominance, affect regulation, and relational interactions. Again, if you are purchasing this for continuing education, there is a course review and outline of everything I've talked about in here that you can download and print out before you take the learning assessment, okay? And if you want to do that now, the link in the promo that I just posted below should take you there. Now, how to collect your free guided meditation and or certificate of completion. So once you click on that link that I've just posted, it's going to take you to a sales page that looks like this. And you'll just click that button right there that says enroll in course for free. Let me see, I think I can use my little tool here. Right here, this one, enroll in course for free, right there. And I can change the color. You guys are just giving me an opportunity to play with this thing right there. So you're going to enroll in course for free. And it's going to take you to your materials, your course materials, and it's pretty self-explanatory. You'll take the evaluation and assessment. Now, if you're here to deepen your knowledge or you would like to deepen your knowledge, I am doing a fast action bonus for attending the webinar today. So I offer another course through my online school, creativeartstherapiesonline.com, which is called Healing Through Attachment Wounds. Okay. And for that one, you will also be taken to a sales page that looks like this, and you would enroll in the course here. It gives you a little description about what's in there. And I'm going to put that offer up now. Okay. So I just posted the link for that. If you decide that you would like to enroll in that course, you can get $100 off today. But this ends in 24 hours. So if you enter code 100 off within the next 24 hours, you get $100 off that course. And there is a more detailed description of that course on the sales page. But basically, it's 7 lessons. And each lesson includes psychoeducational content. It includes guided meditations. It includes arts-based tutorials and things like that. Sometimes, in some cases, self-assessments. So I encourage you to check that out if any of this has resonated with you. And that is the fast action link that should be posted there now. So again, if you're interested in continuing education, you want to go to creativeartstherapiesonline.com and just enroll in the course that is the title for this webinar, Introduction to Attachment Basics, Creative Arts Therapies, or Mindfulness and Creative Arts Therapies. And you'll be taken directly to your course materials, and you'll take the course evaluation and learning assessment to get your certificate. Okay. If you're interested in furthering your learning, there is a fast action bonus if you decide you want to enroll in healing attachment wounds. And to get there, you can click on the link that's up on the screen right now. Enter the code 100 off where it says apply coupon, and you'll get $100 off that course for today. But you have to do that within 24 hours. So I just want to put it out there now just to answer any questions, comments, concerns, things that may have come up for you during the presentation. Here, Nigel said he's curious about attachment in small tribal groups where there are no strangers. How does the baby express attachment distress or not when separated from a primary caregiver? Well, that's an excellent question. I have not read any research specifically on that question, but I'm sure there must be some research out there. I think it is sort of interesting to note and to point out that most of the research that I have talked about today is based in primarily a westernized context. And so, you know, I think that if you do find information about that, that would be really an interesting thing to explore. Martha asks, I'm wondering if the certificate will show that I took it live. Yes, it will. You want to make sure that you take the assessment within 24 hours as well, because you want to make sure that the date is the correct date. So when you take the learning assessment, what happens is the date automatically populates into the certificate and it's automatically sent to your email. So the title is static. The kind of event, so live online event, that is a static text. But the date, your name, those things are not static. I'm probably using technical terms here, but those are the things that can change depending on when you take it. So you want to make sure that you take the learning assessment within the next 24 hours. And Annie asks, can you list the 8 tips again? My notes are missing one. Okay, so Annie, if you go to creativeartstherapieson.line.com, all of the tips are listed in the course outline. You know what I'll do? I'll share my screen with you guys. Let me share my screen. Let's see, I want to do this one. Okay. Okay. Oops, missed this. Okay, so I want you to see a different screen. Application window, this one. Okay, so here you can see my screen. So when you go to creativeartstherapieson.line.com, this is what's going to pop up right here, okay? So right now, first, if you're interested in continuing education, you're going to click on this one, right? That's the title of our webinar. That's what we're doing right now. And you're going to select enroll in course if you do need that certificate. If you don't need that certificate, but you are interested in the guided meditation, you can just scroll down to class curriculum. Over here, you'll see there's like a free preview. So that will allow you to download the meditation and listen to it. It's called The Sacred Body. Okay, that's a little giveaway for attending the webinar. And let's see, we'll go back. If you, over here, this is a preview. So right here, this is a link. If you want to, if you wanted to assess your own attachment style, you can just click that link and it will take you to an online assessment program. The 8 tips is something I actually include in the cost of the course. So let's see, I can go back and show you the last one. Let's see, take a look at my slides. Robert says, where can I find more info on your Healing Attachment Wounds course? Okay, so that's what I'm showing you right now. So right here, if you go to creativeartstherapieson.line.com, it's that course, the very first course right here. Also, you should be able to see the link to it right in the webinar right now. So if you look below the screen, there should be something that that says self-help course, fast action bonus, enter code 100 off at checkout, enroll now, save $100. And if you just click that link, it'll take you directly to the sales page. So does the course begin on a certain date? No. So the course is a self-directed course. So you can sign up. The minute you sign up, you have immediate access to the materials. I'll just show you what it looks like inside. Feb said he missed the first half of the webinar. Will there be a replay? There will be a replay. The replay will be available for about 48 hours. So for Robert's question, this is the sales page for Healing Attachment Wounds. There is a promotional video that you can watch. You know, I'm not going to play the whole thing right now, but basically it's just me talking about the course. So I create, I'm going to get out of that screen. So when you scroll down, this is more of a description of the course and how I work. Here's the two simple steps to how I think this course can work for you. These are the 7 sessions that drip over the course of 7 days. So you get a new lesson every day for 7 days. And the topics include complicated grief and addiction, because I feel like attachment, complicated grief, and addiction are all intersecting. How to transform anxious feelings, the origins of attachment, brain chemistry in relationships, exploring our love patterns, shedding self-fulfilling prophecies, and reclaiming the sacred body. So you're getting a taste of the sacred body because I'm giving away just the audio, but the lesson here includes psychoeducation. It also includes audio visual stuff and some more experiential activities. So that's kind of like what it looks like inside. Let's see if I can show you what it looks like as a logged in user. Okay. So this is your dashboard. If you do sign up for certain courses, it would look like this in your dashboard. These are other courses that I give. So any other questions about that? And there's no certain date. It's self-directed. So you do it at your own time and pace. Any other questions? So again, if you are interested in continuing education, you want to make sure that you purchase your materials and you do your learning assessment today, preferably by tomorrow at the latest, because you want the date to be today. And then the replay will be available for 48 hours. So if you've watched this presentation and you want to watch it again because you missed something, you can watch the replay. It will be available to you for 48 hours. You should get an email within like 30 minutes that gives you access to that. What else can I tell you? I think that's basically it. Any other questions about either how to learn more about healing attachment wounds or how to get your continuing education for today? Or just anything that we talked about? Okay. So we're right on time. So thank you so much for joining the webinar. I appreciate all your feedback. I appreciate your participation in the polls and in the chat box and letting me know where you're coming from with that and how you might be gauging what your attachment style is or what you've observed. I look forward to your feedback. If you have any, please feel free to reply to any of the notifications for this webinar. I will receive it. I love hearing what people have to say. If you have any questions that come up, after we end today, I love questions. Questions are the foundation of what I get to build and create and share with you guys. So if something comes up after we leave the webinar today, please let me know. I'd love to know what you're thinking and how to respond to that. So thank you so much. And I'm going to sign off now. Just want to make sure you guys can hear me okay. All right. Any other questions, just respond to any of the notifications you got for this email and I will respond to it. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great Sunday and have a great week. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Fab.